The sealant town. Amelia was the kind of town you might drive through without noticing. Set against fields of corn and faded red barns, it lay nestled between rolling hills and sleepy two-lane roads somewhere in the American Midwest. Its main street, lined with weathered brick buildings and a handful of stubborn businesses, a grocery, a hardware store, a family-run diner, had changed little in 50 years. On Saturday mornings, tractors sometimes outnumbered cars in the parking lot outside the old town hall. Most folks here were born in Amelia, and more often than not, grew old and died without ever really leaving. It was the sort of place where everyone claimed to know everyone else, and where secrets had a way of shrinking under the relentless gaze of the community. Yet beneath the easy smiles at Sunday church and the murmurs of neighborly concern, there was an unspoken rule. Family matters stayed private. Questions were avoided. Wounds were hidden. Amelia prided itself on stability, on keeping things nice, which sometimes meant pretending not to see what was uncomfortable. Emily Carter, 17, had lived here all her life. She and her mom, Linda, occupied a small gray house down Maple Lane. Linda worked long shifts as a nurse at the county clinic, and Emily learned early to make dinner and keep the house in order. Their family, just the two of them, stood out in a town where households usually ran big and always had a father at the head of the table. But Emily was used to fading into the background. That invisibility had become her armor. Emily's world was school and home, punctuated by trips to the library and the occasional part-time job, helping Mrs. Henderson stack produce at the grocery. At school, she kept her head down, skirting the edges of the busy hallways, completing assignments early, and rarely offering her opinion unless called upon. Among the laughter and easy confidence of her classmates, many of whom came from generations deep Amelia families, she always felt like a polite visitor in someone else's story. The town itself moved to a slow, predictable rhythm. Football games in the fall, the 4th of July parade in the summer, pancake breakfasts at the community center every winter, gossip traveled fast, carried on the lips of women at the hair salon, and men sipping coffee in the diner's corner booth. Good news was celebrated more quietly than bad. Rumors and slights grew legs and wandered the streets without ever knocking on front doors. In Amelia, reputation meant everything, and judgment was never far behind a handshake. Despite its picturesque calm, a kind of stifling silence hovered over the town. Certain topics, family troubles, money problems, who was seen with whom after dark, were talked about in whispers, or, more often, not at all. Emily had learned that speaking up rarely led to understanding. It just made you stand out. So, like most people in Amelia, she became adept at keeping quiet, shrouding her worries and hopes beneath a practiced smile. On the surface, Amelia could have been mistaken for the perfect small town, a place immune to the chaos of the outside world. But Emily, more than anyone, sensed the cost of all that silence, the way it pressed down on her shoulders and seeped into the smallest moments of her day. She could feel it in every cautious greeting, every lesson at church, every careful act of kindness laced with expectation. In Amelia, silence wasn't just the absence of noise. It was a way of life, a shield, a prison, and sometimes, as Emily was about to discover, a heavy, unforgiving price. First love's sweetness. It all began with little gestures, a smile traded across the school hallway, a nod at the library checkout desk, the brush of a shoulder during crowded lunch hours. Emily wasn't used to catching anyone's attention, but Thomas Barton was different. He was the kind of boy whose laughter carried across football fields and who always seemed surrounded by a pack of friends trailing in his wake. His father ran the town's largest farm, and his family name had been etched into Amelia history for generations. For weeks, Emily assumed she was invisible to him. But then one October afternoon, as golden leaves spiraled across the high school courtyard, Thomas sat down beside her during study hall. He asked her about her favorite books. She shyly told him about her love of mysteries and old films. He joked about his hopelessness in algebra, and she surprised herself by offering to help. Little by little, an unexpected friendship flourished, one marked by the kind of innocent flirtation Emily had only read about in novels. Autumn deepened, bringing with it long walks home under trees ablaze with color, texts exchanged late into the night, and nervous laughter shared outside the gym before class. Thomas impressed her with his quick wit and easy charm, and Emily found herself opening up, sharing jokes and secrets she'd kept locked away. He started meeting her at her locker, waiting for her after school, inviting her to watch football practice with his friends. That was when Emily met Thomas's inner circle, a trio of confident, athletic teens. Jake, the quarterback with the endless supply of jokes. Amanda, the cheer captain who welcomed Emily with practiced warmth. And Luke, who mostly listened but always tracked every word. At first, Emily was nervous, an outsider amid their fast-moving banter and inside jokes, but Thomas was persistent. He drew her into conversations, made sure there was space for her at lunch, and included her in weekend plans. For Emily, these were days of quiet wonder. The loneliness she'd long considered normal began to ebb away, replaced by excitement, anticipation, and the kind of nervous joy that makes the world feel new again. She treasured each detail, the way Thomas wrote her name in the condensation on the diner window, the borrowed hoodie draped around her shoulders. After a chilly Friday night game, the impromptu group trips for milkshakes, where she, for once, wasn't invisible. People began to notice. Whispers followed them from classroom to playground, and Emily saw her name, linked with Thomas's, scribbled on the margins of notebooks, whispered in clusters at the lockers. It was as if being with him lifted a veil. Suddenly, Emily was someone. The shy girl in the background had become the subject of conversation, the newcomer to a story written by others' expectations. Emily tried not to mind the attention. She told herself that this was what happiness felt like, a swirl of hope, nervousness, and the thrill of something new. When Thomas squeezed her hand on the bleachers during a home game, her heart beat so wildly she thought he must surely hear it. He was thoughtful, attentive, sometimes a little cocky, but his small kindnesses, carrying her books, walking her to class, texting her goodnight, felt like gifts too fragile to name. For the first time, Emily allowed herself to imagine a broader future, something beyond the careful routines of Amelia. With Thomas, the world appeared larger, brighter, a place where she might finally belong. She didn't see, not yet, the shadows that sometimes flickered behind Thomas's confident eyes. She trusted in the easy laughter and generous gestures, believing that first love, at least for now, was simple and sweet. Betrayal and upheaval. For a while, Emily had let herself believe she truly belonged. She spent autumn afternoons in the glow of new friendships, memories piling up like the leaves beneath the maples, lining Amelia's quiet streets. Thomas became the center of her world, the one who sent her good morning texts, the first to notice when she changed her hairstyle, the boy who made her feel seen. She clung to fleeting moments, giggling with Amanda after football practice, posing for blurry selfies in the diner's back booth, laughing as Jake and Luke argued over band playlists. Everything, her routines, even her dreams, seemed colored by Thomas's presence. But beneath the surface, Emily sensed something changing. Thomas grew distant little by little, arriving late to walk her to class. His replies to her texts suddenly delayed or clipped. Where warmth once greeted her in his gaze, she met distraction and sometimes a hint of irritation. The others followed his lead. Amanda's smiles became tighter, Jake's jokes less frequent, and Luke, always quiet, now seemed guarded and withdrawn. It started small, rumors swirling in whispers behind her back, then the silence that fell as she approached her usual lunch table. Emily could feel the energy shift, like the air itself was heavy with secrets she couldn't name. At first, she dismissed the tension, blaming it on busy schedules and the stress of midterms, but the uneasy looks and murmured conversations didn't fade. Instead, they multiplied until Emily barely recognized the faces of those who, only weeks before, had called her friend. The truth hit with the force of a sudden Midwest storm. She learned from a classmate, embarrassed and apologetic, that Thomas had been spreading stories about her. The details were cruel and exaggerated, painting Emily as desperate, needy, and dishonest. Screenshots from late-night group chats circulated quietly among the students, and Emily's phone pulsed with anonymous messages, mockery, accusations, and the kind of scorn that leaves a sting far deeper than any physical wound. Before Emily could process the betrayal, the wave of isolation crashed down. Thomas stopped talking to her altogether. He wouldn't meet her eyes in the hallway, let alone acknowledge her presence. Amanda and Jake looked away if she drew near. The group she'd been welcomed into so hesitantly now treated her as if she were invisible, or worse, as if her very presence was offensive. At school, teachers seemed oblivious, busy with lesson plans and the endless churn of adolescent drama. Emily's classmates, eager for distraction, latched onto the rumors as if watching someone else's humiliation could keep their own secrets safe. In the grocery store, Emily overheard snippets of conversation. Mrs. Turner at the checkout muttering about troublemakers these days, and a boy in the produce aisle smirking as he texted his friends. Even the library, her old sanctuary, felt unfamiliar with the weight of prying eyes. At home, Linda watched her daughter fade. Emily withdrew, her laughter replaced by silence. Her shoulders hunched as if bracing against an invisible storm. Night after night, Linda worried outside Emily's closed bedroom door, unsure how to offer comfort in the face of so much unspoken pain. The betrayal cut deepest, not because of what Thomas had said, but because Emily had let herself trust. She had believed in the warmth of the group, in the sincerity of a first love, in the kindness that she thought lived beneath the surface of Amelia. Instead, she found herself standing alone in the ruins of everything she'd let herself hope for. As the days dragged on, Emily's world grew smaller, edged with pain and confusion. She wondered what she had done to deserve this. If she should have kept quieter, loved less, trusted more carefully. But deep inside, beneath the shame and sorrow, something else began to take root. The silence that once protected her now felt suffocating, and Emily, forced into the margins by betrayal, began to contemplate how far she was willing to go for truth and for justice. The agony of silence. In the weeks following her public humiliation, Emily Carter's world shrank to the four dingy walls of her bedroom. The lights seemed dimmer, the air heavier, as if the oppressive silence of Amelia itself had seeped through the floorboards and settled in her chest. Each morning, her mother, Linda, would poke a weary head in, her voice gentle with concern. "Are you all right, honey?" Emily always murmured that she was fine, even as she pulled her blankets higher, hiding the red-rimmed eyes that betrayed another sleepless night. Gone were the careless afternoons in the sunlit library, or the warm laughter shared at the diner's back booth. Emily's days revolved now around avoidance, avoiding the stairs in the hallway at school, avoiding the echoing ring of her phone and the venom it often brought, and above all, avoiding her own reflection in the mirror. When she did glance at herself, she barely recognized the tightness in her smile, the trembling in her hands, the haunted look in her eyes. The town, for all its outward normalcy, bristled with tension. The same voices that once greeted her with polite concern now fluttered into silence when she passed. The church pews on Sunday seemed colder, the judgment in each sideways glance sharper. At the grocery, Mrs. Turner bagged Linda's groceries with lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. Even the younger cashiers, who'd once traded jokes with Emily, now averted their eyes, their laughter dropping to conspiratorial whispers as she walked away. Much of the pain was private. In Amelia, suffering was endured behind closed doors, an unspoken agreement, a tradition as old as the town itself. Neighbors didn't air their dirty laundry. Mothers taught their daughters to bear discomfort with dignity, to prioritize family reputation over individual wounds. Even Emily's withdrawal barely raised a ripple. It was easier, after all, for people to fill the silence with rumor than to ask uncomfortable questions. At school, the silence could be deafening. Emily had mastered the art of keeping her head down, sliding into classrooms at the last moment, and escaping as soon as the bell rang. She ate lunch in the dusty corner of the library, her sandwich untouched beside a stack of unread books. Sometimes the shushed giggles and quick glances from other students felt like physical blows, reminders that her name was a punchline in someone else's joke. On bad days, her ears burned with the memory of slights, both real and imagined. On the worst days, she wondered if she would ever feel normal again. Nights were harder still. Sleep brought no rest, only the endless replay of old conversations, the echo of Thomas's laughter, mingling with the harshness of his betrayal. Emily scrolled mindlessly through her phone, fingers hovering over the accounts of former friends. She wanted, desperately, to reach out to someone, anyone, but every message she composed vanished before it could be sent. What could she say? That she felt stranded, marooned in a life that no longer resembled her own, that the loneliness was swallowing her whole? Linda tried in her own way to reach her daughter, but even the kindest words couldn't pierce the shell Emily had grown to protect herself. More than once, Linda hovered in the doorway, wanting to ask, to press, but held back by the same fear that governed so much of Amelia, fear of making things worse by naming what was broken. The two women circled each other on eggshells, united in pain, divided by silence. In this void, Emily's thoughts became relentless. She replayed every moment with Thomas, weighing each word, each gesture, searching for the mistake that had tipped kindness into cruelty. Was it something she'd said, some invisible rule she'd broken? Would things be different if she'd kept her feelings tucked away, never dared to hope for more? She considered more than once disappearing altogether, both literally and figuratively. Maybe she could ask her mom to move away, start over someplace where her name wasn't a stain. Maybe she could erase herself, slip through the cracks, until no one remembered her at all. Yet every time those thoughts crept in, something stubborn pushed back. A dim, flickering hope that this could not be all there was. Amelia had always demanded silence, of its daughters especially. Whispered warnings, passed down through generations. Don't make a scene. Let things be. Some hurts are better left unspoken. Emily had understood, for most of her life, that drawing attention was dangerous, that truth could turn on you if spoken in the wrong company. And yet, as her loneliness deepened, she began to question whether silence really protected anyone at all. Her anger started small. A hot flame curled deep in her gut. At first, it was unfocused, an ache rather than a weapon, but as the weeks dragged on, a new clarity seeped in. Thomas and his friends had rewritten her story out loud, shaping the town's opinion with reckless lies, while Emily was expected to bear it all in quiet shame. The injustice of it stung. The more she turned these facts over in her mind, the more she realized that silence had cost her everything. Her confidence, her friendships, her sense of belonging. And still, around her, the town proceeded as if nothing was amiss. At the annual winter pancake breakfast, she watched as Thomas and the others moved easily through the crowd, laughing and collecting praise from parents and teachers alike. The barely concealed gossip, the sidelong glances, never touched them. Emily wanted to scream, to shatter the polite facade, but her throat locked tight, fear holding her tongue in place. Some nights, she journaled, scribbling sentences she would never speak out loud. Why don't they care about the truth? Why is it so easy to hate the quiet girl? The act of writing offered some relief, but never enough. Still, it marked the tiny invisible shifts happening inside her, the silent rebellion simmering beneath the hurt. One afternoon, as snow threatened to fall, Emily found herself at the edge of town, near the old water tower. From its base, Amelia looked tiny and defenseless, its neat streets and church steeple painted with late winter light. She remembered climbing here with her dad when she was little, listening as he described the town as a place worth defending. Now she wondered, what did it mean to defend a place that wouldn't defend her in return? In the weeks that followed, tiny sparks of action crept into her days. When the librarian, Mrs. Harris, offered a gentle smile and extra time in the reading room, Emily whispered a soft, "Thank you." When a younger girl tripped and spilled her backpack in the hallway, Emily stopped, helped her pick up the mess, and for a brief instant, felt a lightness she hadn't known in months. These moments, rare and fleeting, planted seeds she didn't yet have words for. And with each small act, her desperation shifted, making room for a stubborn resolve. Emily began to pay attention, listening close to stray comments, collecting scraps of gossip that illuminated the ways Thomas and his friends manipulated stories. She realized she was not the only one they'd wounded, not the only person the town had chosen not to see. Late at night, she started saving messages and screenshots, carefully documenting every hurtful rumor, every anonymous threat. Still, the silence pressed in. Emily's pain was real and raw, but in Amelia, pain did not always grant permission to speak. There were days it seemed easier, safer, to retreat entirely. But on the hardest nights, when the ache threatened to overtake her, she remembered her father's voice, her mother's quiet strength, and the flashes of kindness that sometimes broke through the gloom. By the end of winter, Emily stood at a crossroad. The pain of silence, its loneliness, its injustice, felt heavier than any shame the town could throw at her. Something inside her shifted for good. She was not willing to disappear. As the first hints of spring crept into the air, and the town prepared for its next season of routines, Emily began to imagine another way forward, one where her voice might finally be heard, and where silence would no longer be her only option. Rising determination. The first signs of spring came quietly to Amelia, a faint green haze hovering above the thawing fields, sunlight lingering a little longer on the battered sidewalk, a chorus of peepers at dusk. To most, it was the usual shift in seasons, a promise that everything would keep moving as it always had. But for Emily Carter, the changing air whispered something different, something dangerous, the possibility that she didn't have to remain silent any longer. It started in the smallest acts. After months of shrinking from sight, Emily's first step out from the shadows was so gentle, so uncertain, even she barely recognized it. One afternoon in late March, she lingered at the library counter as Mrs. Harris processed her returns. Emily's hands shook as she asked in a barely audible voice if it might be possible to volunteer for a weekend book sale. Mrs. Harris's warm surprise and ready acceptance felt like a door opening, a reminder that not everyone in Amelia had turned away. What followed wasn't a sudden transformation, but a series of tiny, sometimes painful, often awkward attempts to reclaim her own agency. Emily forced herself to walk down Main Street with her chin raised, ignoring the weight of stairs and the stabs of old gossip. She greeted her classmates, even when they responded with coldness or averted eyes. When the math teacher needed a volunteer to pass out homework, Emily's hand shot up, trembling but determined. Every act was a rebellion against the suffocating silence, a statement that she would not completely disappear, but it wasn't enough simply to endure. The anger burning deep within her, fanned by weeks of isolation and reflection, had matured into a stubborn resolve. Something had to change. She saw the injustice of her situation, not only for herself, but for others like her, the quiet kids, the outcasts, girls who learned too young that secrets were a woman's burden and silence a necessary shield. The old stories she overheard in the diner, "Don't get involved, boys will be boys," filled her with a steely clarity. If Amelia wasn't going to protect its own from harm, someone had to call it out. Emily began her campaign for truth, as she had learned to do everything else. Quietly, methodically, she spent hours scrolling her messages and social media, screenshotting cruel rumors and harassing texts. It wasn't easy. Every word felt like a fresh wound. Heart hammering, she reluctantly reread the old group chats, pinning the moments Thomas and his friends had lied about her or twisted her words. She cataloged vague threats, mocking memes, every piece of digital evidence of their campaign against her. She didn't want to wage this fight alone, but she didn't want pity either. Weeks earlier, reaching out had felt impossible. Now, armed with fragments of proof and a fierce sense of purpose, Emily carefully selected someone she might trust. Her choice fell on Ms. Avery, the new guidance counselor who hadn't lived in Amelia long enough to have absorbed its unspoken rules. Ms. Avery was young, principled, and quietly defiant. A transplant from Chicago with bright eyes and a way of listening that made Emily feel seen rather than exposed. Their first meeting happened after school at Ms. Avery's suggestion. Sitting in the small, sunlit office, Emily hesitated, her words stumbling over embarrassment, fear, and the shame that had been forced on her, but Ms. Avery didn't rush her. She simply waited, patient and steady. Little by little, Emily unfolded her story, her romance with Thomas, the rumors, the isolation, the relentless bullying that had followed. She slid her phone across the desk, hands clammy, and waited as Ms. Avery scrolled silently through the screenshots. The counselor didn't say much at first, but the compassion on her face spoke volumes. "Emily," she said quietly when she'd finished, "I'm so sorry this happened to you. I believe you. And you're not alone. Not anymore." Those words, with Ms. Avery's help, the process became less daunting. She taught Emily how to set up a secure folder for her documentation, to record dates and times of incidents, and how to calmly, factually, write her own account. Emily also sent quiet emails to a few students she'd heard had suffered similar attacks from Thomas's group, expressing empathy and offering a listening ear if they wanted it. To her shock, one girl, Megan, a quiet band student, wrote back. Megan described vicious teasing and lies from Amanda and Jake, and after a few messages, she agreed to speak privately with Ms. Avery as well. Suddenly, Emily's suffering felt less singular. Her courage in speaking up inspired others to take uncertain steps of their own. Whispers began to float through the school, not just about old scandals, but about Emily's resolve, the evidence she'd collected, her willingness to stand up no matter how terrified she still felt. The town's long-held traditions of secrecy and victim blaming now faced the smallest but most determined opposition. At home, Linda noticed her daughter's growing resolve. The household remained tense, but some of Emily's old spark had returned. She stayed up late with her notebooks and her phone, focused now not on escape, but on gathering strength. When the time felt right, she sat her mother down at the kitchen table and told her everything, not just about Thomas and the ugly aftermath, but about the way the silence in their community compounded her pain. Linda listened, her eyes brimming with tears, but this time she did not turn away or urge discretion. Instead, she promised to support Emily, even if it meant uncomfortable attention or old friends quietly slipping away. As Easter approached, Emily felt fear's grip loosen, replaced by a heavy but empowering sense of inevitability. She knew that coming forward might make things worse before they got better. Her reputation might never be fully repaired. More rumors might swirl. More friendships might die quietly. But the real risk, she realized, was that nothing would change if she didn't act. That the cycle of silence, isolation, and small town cruelty would simply claim others after her. One afternoon after school, as a warm breeze scattered petals along Maple Lane, Emily opened her window and let the sounds of Amelia in. The laughter of children in the distance, the lowing of cows, the hum of a passing truck. She splayed out her notes and evidence on the bed and stared down at the map of her own ordeal. Her hands no longer shook. She allowed herself a deep, shaky breath. The first time in months, she tasted hope as something solid. That night, she sent Miss Avery a simple text. The determination that had quietly unfurled now sang in her chest. Emily Carter, who had been so carefully erased, was about to make herself heard, unveiling the truth. The days leading up to the confrontation passed in a nervous blur. Emily moved through Amelia High's hallways with new purpose, clutching her folder of carefully printed screenshots, transcripts, and emails like a secret talisman. She could feel the anxiety simmering beneath her practiced calm, the sense that something irrevocable was on the horizon. For weeks, she had hovered between fear and determination. Now, as the moment neared, the blend of the two made every breath sharp and every step deliberate. It began on a rainy Thursday, the kind of day that turned the sky a dull gray and left puddles beneath every leaking gutter. Miss Avery had arranged a special after-school meeting in the school's multi-purpose room, an impersonal space with linoleum floors, faded banners, and rows of metal chairs. The invitation list was small but crucial. Principal Dewar, Ms. Avery, the school counselor, Thomas, and his close friends, and several other students involved in the toxic group chats. Emily's mother, Linda, insisted on accompanying her, sitting close enough to show silent support, but far enough to give Emily space. When Emily walked in, the chatter in the room flickered out. For a moment, she felt that old urge to shrink, to tuck herself away in the shadows. But something in the way Ms. Avery smiled at her, steady and encouraging, helped her keep moving. She took her seat, eyes fixed ahead, hands clenched in her lap. Principal Dewar called the meeting to order, his voice grave but edged with curiosity. We're here today to address a series of allegations concerning student conduct, bullying, and harassment, he announced. glancing at the paperwork in hand. Emily Carter has come forward with claims she wishes to present. Ms. Avery, could you start us off? Ms. Avery nodded and spoke quietly, explaining the context that led to this gathering. She stressed the importance of a safe environment, the right of every student to be treated with dignity, and the seriousness of Emily's documented evidence. Then she turned to Emily, her eyes conveying reassurance. Emily, whenever you're ready. Emily's heart thudded so loudly she could barely hear anything else. Still, she pulled the folder from her backpack, unfolded her notes, and began. Her voice trembled at first, but as she recounted the pattern of exclusion, the insults and group messages, the way rumors had been deliberately spread, she felt a strange steadiness grow inside her. She read aloud from screenshots. Thomas's casual jabs, Amanda's catty commentary, Jake's mocking emojis, the way others had piled on when Emily tried to defend herself. She explained how it felt to watch her world fall apart in real time, to be ostracized, belittled, and left to fend for herself while those responsible went about their lives unchanged. These aren't just words, they follow you. They decide how people look at you, talk to you, if they talk to you at all, she finished, her voice raw but unbroken. She handed Principal Dewar a carefully organized copy of her evidence, messages with timestamps, group chat logs, examples of harassment from anonymous accounts, and coordinated posts on social media. As he and the other adults quietly scrutinized the file, Emily allowed herself to breathe. She had done what once felt impossible. The students sat in stunned silence at first. Thomas, at the center of it all, wore an unreadable expression, some strange crossroads of arrogance and unease. Amanda avoided Emily's gaze, her features stiff. Jake scowled, arms folded. A few of the quieter students looked away, the heat of shame plain in their faces. Principal Dewar broke the silence. Thomas, Amanda, Jake, these messages, are they real? There was only a moment's hesitation. Thomas tried a half-hearted denial, claiming, "It was just joking, nothing serious. Everyone does stuff like this." Amanda, her voice brittle, claimed Emily was reading too much into it. Jake muttered that Emily was making a big deal out of high school drama. But Ms. Avery's calm, unwavering tone cut through their deflections. She read portions of the group chats aloud, the cruelty impossible to explain away. "There's a line between joking and bullying," she said. "This crossed it repeatedly and involved the whole community." Other students in the room looked increasingly uneasy, some glancing at each other with alarm. Megan, the band student who had corresponded with Emily, gathered her courage. "It wasn't just Emily," she stammered, voice shaky but clear. "Anyone who didn't go along with them, me and a couple others, we got it too. They'd freeze us out, call us names in private. I stopped wanting to come to school." The mood of the room shifted palpably. The adults listened intently, their authority now heavy with responsibility. Miss Avery gently encouraged other students to describe their experiences, and soon a small chorus of voices joined Megan's. Stories of being shut out, targeted, or watching helplessly, as friends were silently erased from group chats and invitations. Linda squeezed Emily's hand beneath the table, pride and heartbreak mixing in her eyes. Emily, for her part, felt a curious mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that the truth was no longer hers to bear alone, in sorrow for all that it had cost to arrive here. As the meeting drew on, Principal Dewar assured those present that the school would initiate a full investigation. Thomas, Amanda, and Jake were required to leave the room and wait in the office. Counselors began informal interviews with students who'd spoken up. Ms. Avery outlined resources for support and made clear that no one should face retaliation for their honesty. Word spread quickly. By the next morning, snippets of what had happened appeared in whispered conversations at lockers and lunch tables. Teachers paused when Emily walked into class. Uncertainty and sympathy mingling in their faces. Some students remained skeptical or dismissive, but others offered small signs of support: a nod, a smile, a seat saved at lunch for the first time in months. Emily scarcely slept that night. The adrenaline of the meeting, standing her ground in front of her accusers, revealing the evidence she'd kept secret for so long, had given way to exhaustion and a nagging worry about what would come next. In her journal, she wrote, "For the first time, the walls of her room felt a little less like a cell. There were still shadows of gossip, of backlash, of what ifs, but they seemed a little less oppressive. Somewhere, a crack was forming in Amelia's wall of silence, and Emily could see the light pushing its way through. The process had just begun. There would be meetings, consequences, more difficult conversations. Some people would stay silent or side with power or whisper that Emily was just looking for attention. But she understood now that standing up was not just for her sake. It was for Megan and the other quiet kids watching from the corners, and even for the friends who might never apologize. In unveiling the truth, Emily had found the beginnings of her own strength. And with it, the knowledge that a single voice could sometimes change everything. The storm of public opinion, the shockwaves of Emily's disclosure swept through Amelia with the force of a spring thunderstorm. Overnight, the quiet routines of the town, the peaceful mornings at the diner, the steady bustle at the grocery, the church's Sunday ritual, were fractured by rumor, outrage, and uneasy debate. For years, secrets in Amelia had survived by moving in whispers, skirting polite conversation, slipping quietly behind closed doors. Now, those same secrets were dragged into the harsh light, and no one, it seemed, could look away. At first, the reactions took the form of hushed phone calls and sidelong glances. Parents texted one another late into the night. For Emily, the days after the meeting were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. On the one hand, she felt lighter, the burden of silence lifted, the knowledge that she'd finally made her voice heard. On the other, a fresh wave of anxiety battered her every time she stepped into public. She noticed it in the way Mrs. Turner's usual coolness turned into icy avoidance at the grocery store, the way Amanda's friends stared at her and then looked away, embarrassed or hostile. The school became a crucible of tension. Some teachers made pointed efforts to show their support, lingering with kind words after class, checking in with gentle questions. Others, wary of taking sides, kept their distance. A few staff members, caught between their concern for students and the desire to maintain peace, tiptoed around the subject entirely, as if refusing to speak of the rift would help it heal. Among the students, the reaction was even more volatile. There were those who rallied to Emily's side, emboldened by her courage, the band kids who nodded at her in the halls, the handful of underclassmen who sent quiet messages of solidarity, the school paper editor who asked if Emily might want to write an anonymous editorial about her experience. But for every small kindness, there was backlash. Harsh jokes muttered as she passed, classmates who rolled their eyes or took Thomas's side in angry whispers. An anonymous Instagram account popped up, dedicated solely to arguing Emily's lies were an attention grab. The comments were filled with a mix of support, disbelief, and venom. Outside of school, the community fractured. Some parents demanded sweeping changes to the school's bullying policies. Others accused the administration of overreacting and ruining good kids' futures over teen drama. Emily's mother, Linda, found her own friendships under threat. At the hair salon, longtime acquaintances greeted her with wary politeness, their easy conversation now replaced by stiff silences. One neighbor, who had watched Emily grow up, dropped a casserole at the front door with a note that read, "Yet for every cold shoulder or quiet judgment, there were glimmers of hope." Mrs. Harris, the librarian, thanked Emily for her courage and encouraged her to spend as much time in the stacks as she liked. The pastor at the town's main church, long known for treading lightly on controversial subjects, spoke in his Sunday sermon about the power of truth and the importance of compassion, pointedly quoting, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone." Linda cried quietly through most of the service, grateful not just for the message, but for the handful of parishioners who hugged her afterward. Meanwhile, Thomas and his circle struggled under the scrutiny. The easy confidence that once carried them through the school day began to slip. Their parents met with administrators in tense, closed-door meetings. Some supporters doubled down, insisting that Emily was ruining the reputation of the town's upstanding youth. Others began to drift away, uncertain how to align themselves in a battle that no longer had a simple villain or hero. Deep down, Thomas's group felt their social power wane. They were, for the first time, being watched and questioned, their every word and joke measured by a wary audience. As uproar mounted, the local newspaper ran a short editorial, anonymously penned but clearly shaped by the older generation, urging the community to heal and forgive, cautioning against the dangers of rumor and division. The article, intended to calm the storm, only fanned more debate. Letters poured in, some defending Emily's bravery and demanding accountability, others warning of the dangers of false accusations and the destabilization of Amelia's values. Emily felt all of it. The storm of judgment swirled around her, sometimes receding just enough for her to see that she wasn't alone, sometimes roaring so loudly she could barely find herself inside it. She fielded questions she'd never imagined. Would she press charges? Had she made anything up? Was it worth it? Speaking up at all? Through it all, Linda remained her anchor. On nights when the house seemed to hum with outside anxiety, they sat together at the kitchen table, talk drifting between memories of better days and tentative hope for the future. Linda admitted her own fears about losing friends, about being unable to protect her daughter, about how deeply their lives had been changed. Yet she insisted, again and again, that she was proud. "You did something no one else in this town has had the courage to do in a long time," Linda said, squeezing Emily's hand. Whatever happens, that's worth everything. In the midst of the storm, Emily found herself changed. The pain and loss were real. There were friends she would never regain, invitations that would never come, a version of her old life forever unreachable. Yet she discovered that there was power in honesty, dignity, and persistence. She had inspired others to tell the truth, not just Megan, but a handful of younger students, even a parent or two, who quietly confided their own stories of being dismissed or bullied. For the first time, Amelia's old machinery of rumor and denial sputtered, unable to so easily crush those who chose to speak. As April wore on, the initial frenzy began to settle a little. Opinions still ran hot, gossip still thrummed in the air, but the town had been forced, however unwillingly, to look at itself and ask painful questions. The road to healing would be slow, uneven, and full of setbacks. But beneath the noise, something essential had shifted. And in her small gray house on Maple Lane, as the early flowers bloomed and the peepers filled the nights with their stubborn song, Emily Carter understood that she had weathered Amelia's fiercest storm, not unscathed, but unbroken, and no longer alone. Change and regret. The weeks after the explosion of public opinion left Amelia raw, stripped of the certainty it once clung to so tightly. The winds of rumor and division that had once felt cleansing, blowing away old grievances, clearing the way for new ones, began to die down, leaving a hushed, contemplative quiet in their wake. For the first time in years, people in Amelia were forced to reckon with more than just the surface of their tidy lives. For Thomas and his friends, consequences arrived in undeniable waves. The school's investigation concluded with a gravity that few took lightly. Principal Dewar summoned Thomas, Amanda, and Jake's families to the administrative offices for a tense meeting with Miss Avery and the school resource officer present. The review was thorough. The screen of teen pranks could no longer shield malice disguised as humor. Digital records made the campaign against Emily clear. Thomas, Amanda, and Jake were formally reprimanded for harassment and bullying. It wasn't just a slap on the wrist. Thomas faced a suspension that sidelined him from the end of the spring semester, as well as dismissal from the football team. Jake and Amanda were also suspended and removed from extracurriculars, their college recommendations placed on hold. Together, they were required to write letters of apology, not just to Emily, but to the other students they'd harmed. Publicly, apologies came first as awkward, stammering performances at a school assembly, where Thomas's voice shook with something like remorse, and Amanda's eyes brimmed with tears, half shame and half resentment. Jake could barely look up from his shoes, but it was the private moments, the ones away from the glare of gossip, that hinted at genuine regret. At home, Thomas's parents refused to meet Emily's or Linda's eyes at the grocery store, but neighbors heard arguing through their open windows late into the night. In the weeks that followed, Thomas no longer arrived at school surrounded by friends. He kept his head down, burdened by a weight that could not be shed with a simple sorry. For Amanda, isolation struck hard. Once the center of every party, every group text, she now found herself on the outside, held at a tense distance by classmates who were wary of being associated with her. Some out of outrage, others out of self-preservation. Jake tried to brush off the changes, claiming he didn't care about fair weather friends. Yet even he, in quiet moments, looked hollowed out, haunted by the realization of the harm he had helped cause. But regret was not confined only to those who'd been caught. Throughout Amelia, parents and teachers examined old words and actions, asking themselves when they had turned away from suffering, when keeping the peace had meant keeping the truth out. Church meetings, coffee hours, even Little League games were charged with a new sense of introspection. Mr. Cole, the history teacher, confessed during a faculty meeting that he'd heard some of the rumors and said nothing. Out of fear of conflict, he admitted, but also because it felt easier. Others, too, began to trace the thread back, realizing how the old ways of the town, the let things be, the it's not my business, had reinforced a culture of silence. A handful of parents who had privately supported Emily gained courage from her ordeal. Mrs. Harris, the librarian, organized a community discussion group on bullying and digital responsibility. Linda, who had once shied away from speaking at town meetings, found herself sharing their family's story at a parent-teacher night. The conversations were hesitant at first, then fiercely honest. No one could pretend anymore that the quiet pain of some children was just drama. Not after seeing what happened to Emily, the scars carried on her face, on her body language, on her voice when she answered questions in class. For Emily, the process of healing was gradual, uncertain, and nonlinear. Some days she awoke with the heaviness of old wounds, flinching at every notification on her phone, every unfamiliar glance at her locker. Other days, she felt a fragile sense of hope. When Megan and a few others invited her to study after school, when Ms. Harris asked her to help organize the summer reading program, when a quiet freshman approached her after class to say thank you for giving her the courage to speak up about her own bullies. Therapy sessions, once something to dread, became a sanctuary, a place where Emily could say the unsayable, mourn what she'd lost, and begin to recognize her own resilience. Ms. Avery met with her weekly, teaching her to rebuild trust with both friends and herself. Sometimes Emily caught glimpses of the girl she used to be. Curious, quick to smile, unafraid to raise her hand. More often, she felt like someone new was taking shape. A person forged by hardship, but not defined by it. Linda worked to support her daughter's recovery, trying to give her the space to grow, but also the safety of home. She found her own regrets surfacing, for not pushing harder, for not asking questions sooner, for all the times she let fear of gossip guide her parenting. Yet Emily always reassured her, knowing that guilt changed nothing, and that what mattered was moving forward together. The shift in the town was neither swift nor complete. There were still whispers, some sharp, some sympathetic, some uncertain. There were still old friends whose invitations never returned, adults who changed the subject when Linda entered the room. But cracks had appeared in Amelia's shield of politeness. Student council leaders worked with Ms. Avery to organize anti-bullying workshops. The principal implemented stricter digital policies and encouraged students to report concerns early. For the first time, the PTA invited a speaker who spoke frankly about the dangers of silence and the costs of unchecked rumor. One afternoon in May, as the town gathered for the spring festival, Emily walked through the fairgrounds beside her mother. There were moments when she felt every eye on her, every whisper like a sting. But there were also moments of gentle acknowledgement. Miss Harris waving from the bookstall, Megan and her friends saving her a seat at the pie eating contest, even Thomas's mother managing a nod that, however awkward, felt like a start. Under the early summer sun, Emily felt the world widening again, possibility stretching before her. Regret lingered, reminding everyone just how much pain words and silence could cause. But something new was blooming alongside it. Change, at first slow and halting, had taken root in Amelia's soil. For Emily, that was reason enough to hope, even to forgive. Not everything, not right away, but enough to step out into the light and imagine a future that belonged to her as the to pay spring matured. Into summer, coating Amelia's main street in sunlight in the bittersweet shadows of change. While life in the town slowly settled after months of uproar, Emily Carter moved through her days acutely aware of the price she'd paid for speaking out. The scars were real, not only on friendships and reputation, but also written quietly into her heart in the ways she now measured trust, weighed words, and looked at her own reflection. The most visible cost was social. The web of relationships that once quietly tethered Emily to Amelia had been irreparably strained. There were friends who simply faded from her life, calls that were never returned, invitations that never came. Even those who had been bystanders seemed reluctant to get too close, as if fear of association would draw the storm back over their own heads. It wasn't open hostility, but rather an uneasy distance, as though the courage to disrupt Amelia's silence had marked Emily as someone unpredictable, even dangerous. Parties came and went without her. She heard the laughter and music on warm Friday nights, drifting through windows as she read alone, casting weary glances at her unused phone. Hallway conversations at school, quieted or turned when she approached. Former classmates who'd once shared inside jokes now offered tense, polite nods, their eyes filled with something she recognized. Guilt, perhaps, or maybe discomfort that the pain she'd exposed could have belonged to any of them. Some friendships endured, but they were different now, defined by caution and a hard-won honesty. Megan's circle, forged in the aftermath of exposure, was smaller but truer. Their shared experiences created a bond no outsider could fully understand. Late-night talks about small cruelties and acts of kindness. Laughter that crackled with relief as much as joy. An instinct for checking in on one another when the days grew heavy. In Megan's company, and with a few friends from the library and the band, Emily found a gentler kind of loyalty. A circle shaped not by popularity or convenience, but by the mutual recognition of vulnerability and courage. The emotional cost, however, cut even deeper. Emily woke some mornings with a heaviness she couldn't immediately name, a residue of fear and doubt that clung long after the events themselves. She replayed old conversations in her mind, times she'd laughed with Thomas, the flutter of hope on autumn mornings, memories now tainted with betrayal. The wounds left by his cruelty, with the echo of his lies, and the way he'd erased her from his world with a few careless texts, did not heal evenly. There were dreams that returned some nights, where her classmates turned away, or her own mouth filled with sand when she tried to speak. Therapy helped, With Miss Avery's gentle encouragement, Emily learned to confront these memories, to accept not only her sadness, but her anger and her pride. She discovered that grief came in waves, that it was possible to love what had once been and mourn its loss, even as she refused to regret the price she'd paid for the truth. For time, her internal scars became less about shame and more about survival, era markers of a battle she had chosen to fight, reminders that vulnerability could be strength. There were days she missed what her life had been before, simpler days when anonymity had at least offered protection, when she hadn't been the subject of whispers or the symbol of change in a town uncomfortable with reflection. But even in her worst moments, Emily realized that going back would have been the bigger loss, that the cost of silence, for her and for others like her, would always have been higher in the end. Linda paid a price too. Their little house on Maple Lane became quieter, but the silence was filled less with fear and more with resilience. Some neighbors kept their distance. A few quietly unfriended her online, and those who called to gossip about other parents no longer rang. But others, touched by Emily's story and Linda's unwavering support, showed their solidarity in quieter ways. A hand on her shoulder in church, a plate of cookies left on their porch, a whispered thank you after a PTA meeting. Linda gained new strength from her daughter, embracing what it meant to be outspoken, to defend her family, even as it cost her some old securities. Financially, the price was subtle but real. Emily cut back on after-school work at the grocery store, unable to tolerate the stares and whispering customers, choosing instead to give more of her time to volunteer work at the library or helping the school organize awareness events. She and her mother budgeted carefully, and while things were tighter, both recognized that what they'd lost in convenience they'd gained in self-respect. The final cost, and perhaps the most unexpected, was the weight of expectation. Once Emily had spoken out, others in Amelia, students, parents, even teachers, began to confide in her. A sophomore girl asked for advice after being bullied on social media. A middle-aged woman stopped her in the grocery store to share a long-ago secret. With each conversation came gratitude, but also a quiet plea for leadership, as if by surviving her ordeal, Emily had unwittingly become the town's conscience, or at least its example. This burden unsettled her at first. Who was she to offer guidance, to stand as a model for courage, when she still fought her own battles every day? Yet with time and careful boundaries, Emily learned to share what she'd gained. Not perfect answers, but a willingness to listen, to validate, to encourage others to speak up and seek help. She realized her experience had given her not only pain, but also the power to comfort, to witness, to assure others that survival was possible, even if scarred. Despite all that had been lost, the price Emily paid had brought its own strange kind of freedom. She stopped apologizing for her presence, for taking up space with her own beliefs, for feeling deeply. She discovered joy in quieter moments, the sensation of sunlight on her face as she walked home from school alone, Laughter echoing over the tables during game night at Megan's house. The comfort of knowing that the truth, though costly, set her on a path to a life lived more honestly. And in the slow work of healing, she found grace for herself, wounded and courageous, for her mother, learning to be brave in her own way. And even as the bitterness faded, for her former friends and tormentors, who were also growing and stumbling, struggling with regret, learning, slowly, what it meant to repair what had been broken. Forgiveness was not quick, nor always possible, but it was an idea she turned over gently in her mind, something to aim for, as the shadows of the past lengthened and softened with each passing day. The price Emily paid was real and lasting, marked in losses visible and invisible, but with spring turning to summer and the fields beyond Amelia shimmering beneath the wide Midwestern sky, she recognized at last that her pain had a purpose, and that to bear it fully was to claim, piece by piece, the freedom and dignity she'd once thought forever out of reach.